Thank you for joining me at another Coffee with Dr. A. This week, I get to talk to one of my good friends, colleagues, co-authors, Dr. Brandon Sheridan at Elon University. We're going to go over a lot of his background, how he ended up in economics, actually how a high school economics class helped him end up where he is today. We're going to talk about his research, his one of my favorite papers that I've read in economics education. And we'll get a little bit of his tips for job market candidates entering the job market this year. And it should be a good conversation. I'm glad that you're joining us today. Sit back, enjoy this conversation, and use the live chat to tell us what you're thinking. Brandon, welcome to Coffee with Dr. A. Do you have your cup of coffee, by the way?
I do. I'm ready to go.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. I'm excited to have a conversation with you to catch up. It's been a while since we really talked. We have a couple of projects going on, so this is a good time for us to regroup and hear about what you've been doing. I could go into a deep introduction about who you are and how we're connected, but one thing that I try to do on this channel is let people introduce themselves so the world gets to hear about what they're working on from their perspective. So with that said, Brandon, what does the world need to know about you?
I don't know if the world really needs to know anything about me. But thanks for having me. I appreciate you having me on. I'm excited to do this. I'm excited about sort of what you're building over here and amplifying some of these conversations. So I'm Brandon Sheridan. I graduated from Kentucky with my Ph.D. in economics in 2012. Prior to that, I did my undergraduate work at Center College, which is where my coffee mug is featured from today.
Okay.
So kind of showcase them just a little bit. So that was an important part of what made me, I think, who I am today. So that's kind of why I mentioned that. So graduated from undergrad in 2006, graduated with my PhD in 2012, had my first academic job right after that at North Central College, right outside of Chicagoland. And then I'm now in my fifth year at Elon University. Focused primarily on two different sort of parallel tracks of research. So I'm really interested in education and pedagogy and doing things well in the classroom and having that be evidence-based. I'm also really interested in economic growth and international trade and sort of the intersection of those.
Great. That's a great introduction. And there's already a couple of questions that I have. The thing that is really important for us to talk about today is the state of the world and the macroeconomy and economic growth. There's a lot that's changing, a lot of external influences. What do you see as the biggest struggle right now from a macroeconomy or international economic perspective?
Well, I mean, I guess the pandemic would be number one. Just in the time that we're recording this, I mean, you can't. It's really hard for businesses to plan and to have stability if they don't know what's going to happen from one week to the next in regards to whether they're allowed to be open, whether even if they are allowed, if customers are going to come to their businesses, and so that just makes it really challenging. From a macro perspective, I think we were trending in a decent direction prior to that. In sort of macroeconomic terms, I think there were some risks to sort of the stability of the global order with rising sort of nationalist movements across various different countries. That makes it just harder to do trade and conduct trade policy and things like that. So those would be some of the the risks that I would have seen prior to the pandemic.
Okay, so I think we share this view, and if we don't, we could disagree on about it over here. But my view on this is you can't really fix the economy before fixing the pandemic and the health issue. Policies will be temporary otherwise. So I've been advocating for making sure that we have a vaccine and, the whole testing and isolating. Is this something if you want to go down this route, something that you advocate for, or do you see a different role for government here with respect to?
No, I mean, no, 100%. You're right. I mean, you can't. The economy will go as we solve the virus, and so it looks. At this point, I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be with us for quite a while, even if there is a vaccine. I mean, the people that I've heard have talked about it not being widely sort of available and administered until probably late next year, late 2021 at best, sort of. So it's going to be with us for a while. And so we need to, at this point, adapt. And part of that means, wearing masks out in public and when you're around other people and taking the social distancing seriously. I think what happens is people get this sort of fatigue and they let their guard down. So people that they maybe interact with regularly, they start to not wear their mask around them, not maybe knowing if that person crossed paths with somebody in a grocery store or at a restaurant or something that maybe was just sort of a one-off thing, but where they catch the virus. And so if everybody takes the virus seriously, then that's going to help us, I think, significantly from the economic perspective. It just takes a few people to not comply to start that spread again and to start decreasing economic activity again. So I'm completely with you there.
Yeah. So I mean, we're seeing at the time of this recording an increase in cases actually higher than the first wave, and I attribute it to this whole debate about lockdown versus social distancing, however way you want to call it. But also fatigue, and behavioral economics talks about this. And there's a lot of research about how to continuously improve people's abidance by the expectations, the social expectations. But hopefully this will be behind us soon, so we could get back to the trajectory that we were on before the pandemic. So a lot's happening in the world. You said another area of interest for you is economic education, and you and I have co-authored several papers in that area. Well, one of your papers that I really love is the one that you've that I've seen you present most recently, and that's the one about educators' perceptions about how much active learning they actually conduct in class. Could you give us, one, the title, and then two, what's the paper about, and where does it currently stand in the whole paper pipeline process?
Yeah, sure. So the paper is titled "How Often Does Active Learning Actually Occur? Perception versus Reality." So the genesis of the paper was really thinking about how do we measure what we do in the classroom, and we really don't have any metric of what we do. So, there's student evaluations, but I think it's pretty clear that students aren't really qualified to evaluate whether or not what a professor is doing in the classroom is effective or not. They can perceive, do they enjoy that experience? But even within that realm, I think we've seen just reams of evidence that the student evaluations are biased. And so those are really problematic to use as a metric for measuring somebody's teaching. So I was trying to look for a different way. And there are classroom observation tools, but those are really labor intensive. So you have to have somebody come in and physically observe your class, and they have to write down everything that you're doing, in some cases everything that the students are doing, continuously throughout the entire class. And that's only one class, right? And you probably know that they're going to come to that class. You maybe even invited them specifically to that one because you think it's particularly a good class. And so there's all sorts of problems with that, right? You get very little data, objective data about what you're doing. So I found some researchers in biology had actually created this tool that they dubbed DART. So it stands for Decibel Analysis for Research and Teaching. And what they did was they really took this classroom observation protocol that would usually have a physical person in class actually observing you, and they put it into a software program. And so the way the program works is you record the audio from your class session, and you run the audio through this program, and it gets back to you. It breaks down your class into 3 different sections. So times when there is just a single voice speaking. So this could be a single voice. This could be the professor. It could also be a discussion. So it could be one of your students, or it could be, students take turns talking. Depending on the pause between the students, that would probably come up as single voice. You also have multiple voice. So I think about this as times when you might do some sort of like think, pair, share, where students are talking back and forth about a problem or something like that. And then you have no voice. And so that's when it's completely sort of silent in the class, or at least close to silent. And so what the researchers found when they were validating this tool, this instrument, was times when single voice occurred was most associated with sort of passive learning. So most often lecture. The one caveat would be discussion, and that would be sort of a weakness of the tool. But yeah, so most often, single voice was most used, and it was also most passive. So times of active learning were associated with the times when there was multiple voice or no voice. So we took that and said, let's just record a bunch of our class sessions and see where we are. And luckily we had the forethought to, I keep saying we, so this is co-authored with Ben Smith from University of Nebraska at Omaha. Luckily, we had the forethought to ask professors at the beginning of a semester, what do you think? Like, what proportion of your class is active learning? Like for an average semester, just like what would you think the average would be? And then we recorded their class sessions. So they went in and voluntarily sort of recorded every class session throughout the entire semester, and then sent us the recordings. And we analyzed them, and what we found was we're much more passive than we think we are. So the perception, I think, is somewhere around like 78.5% is what we think we lecture, when the reality is closer to 90%.
Wow, that's a big difference.
It's a huge difference, right? And we had. We had a really large sample. I think we ended up with over 30 different instructors, well over 500 class sessions, and so this is a lot of data. And the interesting thing for us was the instructors were really eager to kind of see themselves, to have this whole semester worth of data, and I think some are even continuing to use it now, even though the experiment is over, because it gives you something to talk about in a classroom. You can now objectively show, I'm doing these different things in the classroom, and look here, you can see where I'm doing them. I can show you the output that shows here's the active learning times, and here's the times when I was doing this different activity. And look, oh, by the way, that corresponds to maybe better grades or whatever other metrics that you want to talk about. So it gives us, it's a step in the right direction. It's not a cure-all for trying to measure effectiveness of teachers in classrooms, but I think it's a step in the right direction of giving us something objective that we can use to improve our own teaching in important ways.
Yeah, you can't change something that you don't measure, first of all, right? So this is a good step towards that. You've highlighted some measurement error issues that might arise with, how do you tell who's really talking? How do you handle discussion? Discussion could be considered active learning approach, but it's better than what we've had. And obviously there's a difference between the perception and the reality. You said you surveyed 30 educators. Is there variation in the types of educators, and could you tell types of educators? So what measures of identification do you have?
Yes. So we have lots of demographic information about the instructors. So we know gender identification. We know what discipline they teach in. So it wasn't just economics instructors. It was a lot of different business school disciplines. So I think we also had accounting, marketing, management, and and maybe entrepreneurship. So we had multiple different disciplines spread out across the different instructors, and we also know whether they were tenure track or not tenure track, and then how many years of experience they had on the job. So we had lots of different information about the instructors. Yeah.
And not to get too detailed in the paper, but do you see any variations in the type of educators that might use active learning more than others?
I caution here because I don't really think we had enough data to really say in a rigorous way. So when you're looking at the combined data of the classroom recordings, that's a lot of data, and that tells us in aggregate sort of what's going on. But when you're trying to compare 30 different instructors and then divide those into smaller samples, there really wasn't a lot that we could sort of deduce from that.
So you've written that paper. I've watched you present it several times, and in academics, there's a big lag between writing, presenting, getting it vetted, and submission. Where is the paper as it currently stands?
Yeah, so it was just published in the May 2020 edition of the American Economic Association's Paper and Proceedings. So I presented this as part of
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I presented it as part of the AA's annual conference in early 2020, which seems like 10 years ago at this point. But as part of being accepted to the conference, which was a competitive process, and then going through peer review to get to you had to go through peer review as part of being accepted into the conference. So the paper was peer reviewed and then was accepted for publication. So it's out there in the world now.
Well, once again, congratulations, and I'll make sure to link to that article in the description and the episode notes. So that's one paper that you've been working on. What other research are you currently working on?
So outside of my research on education, I'm doing a lot of research right now centered around trade and around economic growth. And
construction.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
No, that was actually my coffee maker.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. It won't beep again. So I'm doing a lot of research right now around international trade and economic growth. And one of the things that sort of sparked my interest in graduate school was looking at these nonlinearities in the growth process. So, if you think about it, no country grows in a linear way, right? It happens in sort of fits and starts. So you have some good times and you have some bad times. I mean, it's cyclical, right? And what we want to look at is, what is it that could spark a country to grow at a higher rate for a sustained period of time? And we wanted to look specifically at the role that trade plays in this relationship. Now, partly that's because we have really robust trade data out there that's available, and a well-validated empirical framework in the gravity model to help us study this. So that was one of the big attractions to doing this type of study. But so we look at some of the literature and how they measure economic growth. And so traditionally, you might measure growth as GDP per capita growth over some period of time. So we take a different approach. We follow some of the more recent research in the field and identify growth episodes. And so is there a country that has a growth takeoff or not? So do they go from 1% or less economic growth per year to higher than 3% per year for a sustained period of time? So that would be a growth episode. So it's looking at the issue in a slightly different way, rather than trying to focus on percentage change in economic growth rates. Looking at sort of, are you in a takeoff or are you not, and then what role does trade play in getting you to that point?
And your punchline to non-academics or non-economists, what would you tell?
So the punchline is that trade is important, right? So trade, increasing the amount of trade that you have, both the volume of trade that you have, but specifically the number of trading partners that you have and the number of products that you're exporting. So this idea of sort of diversification or the extensive margin in the lingo of the discipline. But the punchline is that trade works. If you trade more, it's going to be more likely to lead to growth. And so this could happen for a number of different reasons. And part of our research is figuring out what some of those reasons are. So some of that could be because of economies of scale. So if you're producing for a larger number of consumers, then you're gonna realize some cost advantages. Some of that could be spillovers. So if you're in a domestic market competing with a firm that is also selling to an international market, it makes you better. You have to be more efficient, and you learn from the things that they do. And so you could get some efficiency gains that way, and that could cause growth in the country. And, that there could be spillovers to, you might attract a more educated workforce. It might inspire more people to get educated. So even if they don't end up working in these particular sectors, they still reap the advantages from that in their home countries.
Well, as an economist and as a citizen of the world, that really makes me happy to hear, because we started off this discussion with the observation that there's been an increase in these nationalist movements where borders have been the advocacy is to close borders rather than open them. So this is evidence, or your research is evidence, that opening up borders will actually enhance the quality of life of the citizens.
Right. And we already have that evidence with immigration, right? We have pretty robust evidence that immigration is good for the country receiving the immigrants. There's actually a lot of research out there worried about the other direction, right? The so-called brain drain, where you lose people from your country. So we already know that immigrants are good for growth, and we know that there are costs from trade. I don't want to make it sound like trade is a cure-all, but it is something that can significantly help prosperity within a country.
Great. So exciting research. I love what you're doing from the pedagogy and the discipline area. One thing that I think is important for us to highlight is, at least in the economics profession, there's an emphasis on, going to top schools and end up at top schools. But, you could have a good quality life teaching and doing research at any school. So what has your path been, and what is your advice for people going through the job market this year? Because it's going to be a tough job market. Sorry, job market candidates. But what's the advice that you'd want to give to people, at least based on your path?
Yeah, this year's going to be rough, I feel, for those job market candidates. So you bring up an interesting issue. So my advice really is to talk to as many people as you can about a particular field. I had no idea going into college. I was a first generation college student. I had no idea really what college was the way that I do now, right? I didn't know what professors did, right? I had this, I guess, perception of what they did, but I had no idea that they did research, for example, right? I didn't know what that looked like. I didn't know what the grad school process looked like, or what you were expected to do, or what classes I should have been taking if I wanted to do that. Like, I had no idea about any of that. And that's nobody's fault, really. And, it's not like I don't blame anybody for not telling me that. It was just not something I was exposed to where I grew up. So I think. And
where is it that you grew up? Sorry, Brendan. I don't know where home is.
Yeah. So home is Western Kentucky. So if you look at where Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois come together, I'm on the Kentucky side. And one of the things that I think was important for me, sort of starting my journey into econ, was actually in high school. We had the opportunity to, as high school students, to take summer courses for free at a community college in Illinois. So it's right across the river. So you had to meet certain GPA requirements. And, I think there was a lot of people that probably met those requirements, but not very many people. I don't know that anybody other than me actually took advantage of it, which makes sense. I mean, kids in high school, especially 20 years ago, I mean, you had different priorities, especially coming from a place where going to college wasn't it wasn't, I guess I would say it wasn't necessarily the norm. Whereas now in a lot of places, going to college is assumed for a lot of, for some high school graduates. It wasn't, I lived in a place where that wasn't necessarily assumed at all. So it was unique that I took advantage of that, and probably says something about me, honestly, a little bit nerdy to want to go take college classes after you've already taken a bunch of high school classes. But that's where I got introduced to economics, because we didn't offer any sort of econ class in my high school, but I took an econ class at that community college. And so I learned a little bit then sort of about what econ was, enough that when I finally did make it to college, that became one of my majors. And even then I still didn't really know, right? I took, I think, an introductory principles class, and I don't even necessarily remember all of the contents, but I do remember sort of taking it and thinking, oh, I could study this. Like, this is interesting. I took that in a politics class, and both of those turned out to be a major when I got to undergrad. But then in undergrad, I really sort of learned a lot more about economics and sort of the way of thinking that it engendered in people, and I really liked it. I mean, it was just something that I really enjoyed. So after graduation, again, my naivete is I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so I went to work, and eventually I thought, I don't want to do this job forever that I was doing. I was working in economic development for like a local government office, which was not at all important. I mean, not for me. I mean, it was important for the county, but I wasn't like an important cog in that machine. And it just, to me, it wasn't really that interesting. I knew that I couldn't do that forever, but I did still really love economics. And so I started to research grad school on my own. So I didn't know anything about it. I just started researching grad school programs. And I thought, my thinking was, well, you could do a master's, it sounds like, or a PhD. Why don't I do a master's first? First of all, to demonstrate that I could do graduate work in case I want to get a PhD. And because I thought, well, if I get a master's, that will be enough that I could get a job at like some sort of policy think tank, which is what I thought I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to do research policy, because I knew that I didn't want to be in politics. I completed an internship on Capitol Hill as an undergrad, and politics was just not something I was interested in. But policy, on the other hand, was interesting. So I applied to only master's programs. And I got funding at a lot of them. And there was one program in particular that I applied to, the master's program, but just by sheer luck, it also had a PhD program, and that was the University of Kentucky. And so I can remember Bill Hoyt, the department chair at that time, sending me an email saying, well, like, we don't really have a separate master's and PhD program. It's kind of like all in one thing. And so they accepted me to the PhD program. So now I'm looking at these offers, and I have this offer from UK to start a PhD program, and the offers from these other schools to start a master's program. And so I just thought, well, let's just go ahead and try the PhD. If it doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. So that's sort of I think a roundabout answer to your question. But yeah, so I came into grad school really sort of naive about the whole process and what I could even do or what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to work at a policy think tank. But when I got into grad school, I really enjoyed the teaching aspect of it and connecting with students.
So we both went to University of Kentucky, and I just recently had an episode with Darshak Patel, who was at the University of Kentucky, and it turned into an ad about grad school at UK. The one benefit that I had from being at the University of Kentucky is, I think by the time I graduated, I had taught 9 independent sections as a primary instructor in a TA role. And when I was out in the market, from a teaching perspective, I felt comfortable teaching any class because I knew how to develop new classes. How many classes did you teach, or do you remember your teaching experience at the University of Kentucky?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely remember that experience. So I think I taught 8 classes as the instructor of record. And the first course I taught was statistics, which for me was sort of like a personal triumph, because in undergrad, like many undergrads, I had a few rough semesters where I was really enjoying college. You know, not the studying, but I was enjoying college, and I had I think a C- in statistics, and that was probably honestly a gift, just so the professor didn't have to see me again. But so I retook that course before starting grad school, just to kind of demonstrate that it was me, it wasn't, or that it was the circumstance. It wasn't that I couldn't do the work. So I got an A in that, I think. And so it was a personal triumph to say, I'm going to teach statistics first, because I know that I'm really going to need this, and that'll be kind of resolution to that old conflict that I had with statistics. So I definitely remember the number of courses I taught. I remember the experience; it was exhilarating. I'm sure if we're honest, University of Kentucky might have some mixed feelings about having us teaching so many courses, because your research suffers a bit, but I would also say, what you said earlier about, this perception of you need to go to elite schools and be researchers and this and that. I mean, that's great. And that's certainly, there's a lot fewer Ivy League schools than non-Ivies. And so those non-Ivies need good people to not only do research, but also to do teaching really well and to care about teaching. And I think that's something that really attracted me to Elon, where I am now teaching. Is they really emphasize both. So I don't have the research expectations that I would at an R1, certainly. But they highly value good research. They put resources behind that, but they also really want you to be a really good teacher. And I think that's something that probably helped me get the job, was not only my teaching experience in my previous job, but the fact that I had taught so much in grad school. Like, you get a lot more of that exposure.
Yeah, and as we're talking about this, I find myself struggling a little bit, because I'm using language that I wouldn't use. I'm using the market perception, or what you would see on social media or through discussions with academics. This whole definition of what is elite, it makes it sound like we are not at elite places, or there's a hierarchy. Really, it's just a distribution where, on one side you're research intensive, and the other side you're teaching intensive. And you have to find that balance that works best for you. For instance, I know I cannot be at an entirely research oriented position, because I get a lot of my energy to do research through teaching, through that engagement, through trying, going to class gives me a lot of energy. So, some people might look at teaching 9 courses over your 4 to 5 years in grad school as a lot of distracting from research. For me, it complemented the research. It gave me that break from research to kind of kickstart the whole diminishing marginal product schedule again. So I want to challenge that conversation that people have about, elite. There's Ivy schools, that's the league that they play in. But the definition of elite or a good position versus a bad position, that's extremely subjective.
And I think, if I could, I think that one of the things I recognized was that, so using econ terminology again, my comparative advantage was in teaching. It wasn't that I couldn't do research, or that I wasn't good at it, or that I didn't enjoy it. I do enjoy research. I still enjoy research. But I realized early on that, I'm not a person that's probably going to publish a top 5 econ journal. And I think there's so much pressure on graduate students to be that sort of person, that if you aren't able to do that, you feel somehow like you're not succeeding in the profession. And I don't know what helped me sort of change that mindset, but I was just like, you know what, maybe I'm not going to do these top 5 publications, but I really, really love teaching. And I don't say this very often, but I feel like I'm good at it. Not just the comparative advantage part, but I feel like I'm good at it. And I think part of the reason that I'm good at it is because I embrace it so much. I think about teaching all the time. In everything that I do, I'm always thinking about, how can I use this in the classroom? How can I bring this opportunity to students? And like you said, it really gives me, I'm usually floating when I come out of a classroom, just because it's so much fun to share that knowledge with students, and to see them grasp some concepts and feed off of that energy that you bring, that then I can take that and carry that over into research and shut the teaching off for a few hours maybe, and then plow down into the research. So to me, I think I've found a balance that really suits me. And I think that more people would do better to sort of accept and realize what their balance is.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And, the way I will summarize this conversation, or this part of the conversation, is if you're a job market candidate, really evaluate what is your personal preference on that balance between teaching and research. The market or society, the profession, will try to tell you that one job is better than the other, but that's not necessarily the case for you. I believe that I've had an extremely successful career at Northern Kentucky University, and I love what I do. Every day is a great day. So does it have challenges? Yes, but overall, I'm extremely happy, and it's a good balance of teaching and research for me. And with that said, tell us a little bit more about your role at Elon. So Elon Liberal Arts College, is that how you would describe it?
Yeah. So I don't know if there's probably a terminology that they would get mad that I don't know. I would call it more of like a comprehensive liberal arts institution. So we're now ranked as a national university. So we used to be a regional university, and they got rid of those distinctions. But for ranking purposes, whatever that's worth. And the reason I say that is because we do have a solid grounding in the liberal arts. That's how the college was started. But we also now have some professional programs. We have a business school. That's where I'm located in the economics department. But we also have a lot of other professional programs, physical therapy and education and things like that. But so with that focus and that grounding in the liberal arts, teaching is really important. And so in my role, I'm one of the sort of applied macroeconomists in the department. And so one of my regular courses is Intermediate Macroeconomics, probably my favorite course to teach. I just love teaching that course. I also teach international trade, which is a lot of fun. This semester I've taught the Federal Reserve Challenge, which has just been a joy. I've been a part of that now for the past few years. And although we haven't won the competition, as I tell my students, it's much more about the journey than it is the destination. I mean, whether or not you get a trophy at the end of the day isn't going to change how much you learned along the way. So I think that's really sort of been my focus is picking a core group of classes, and of course I teach principles as well. But picking a core group of classes, having a department that's big enough that you can select a smaller number of classes and getting really good at teaching those classes, and then bringing in some of these extracurricular opportunities to students.
So, and what's typical class size at Elon for you?
Yeah, so typical class size is we're capped at 33 in the business school. Most of my classes will reach that, just because most of the classes I teach are some requirement for some program somewhere. So the exception will be the Fed Challenge, which we typically only have like 10 or 15, and we try to keep that smaller. But yeah, so 33 class size. We have Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we have hour and 10-minute classes. Tuesday, Thursday, we have hour and 40-minute classes. So Elon's a little different because we have we do 4 credit hour classes. So you meet 4 hours a week or 3.5 hours a week rather than maybe the more traditional 3.
And your what's your course load per semester on average?
Yeah, so the course load is 6 courses a year. We can get reductions in that. So, and I've been lucky to always always teach less than that, which sounds counterintuitive because I was talking about how much I like teaching. But part of those course reductions allows me to do some of that research that otherwise I probably wouldn't have the time or the space to do. And a lot of my research being on economic education informs my teaching. So I typically will teach probably 4 or 5 classes per year.
Okay, great. And so let me see. Oh yeah, so you advise a lot of economic students. We've talked about some of the struggles going into the econ major. One of the questions that I usually get is, what does an econ major actually do? Because like you actually had more background about economics than I did when I went to undergrad. How do you handle that conversation with possible advisees or people interested in the major?
Yeah, so first I get really excited if I meet a prospective student and they have any interest whatsoever in economics, because you're right, it's really rare. And part of that is because econ is not sort of widely taught in high schools, or students have this misperception that economics is about making money, right? I had that perception in high school too. I was like, okay, well, economics is business and it's going to teach me how to play the stock market. And that's not at all what economics is about, right? It's not the stock market. You're in the wrong class if that's what you think. But so I tell students, what do you want to do with an econ, or what can I do with an econ major? You can do anything that you want. And so rather than talk about economics, I typically talk to them about their interest. So what sort of things are you passionate about? Is there some sort of policy issue or social justice issue or a health issue? Anything like that you're really interested in. And normally they can come up with something, right? And I say, oh, well, there's research on, and then we kind of go through that whole thing, right? So we were talking, I was talking to a group of new students at the beginning of the year, and I forget how we got on the topic or the conversation, but we were talking about some of the events that happened this summer, and the need for criminal justice reform. And I said, well, economics has a lot to say about that. We have some really talented researchers doing great research in the area of crime, and they come up with some results that you might not necessarily expect. And so we had some conversations sort of around that. So I always try to steer the conversation, not so much about, well, here's all the things I think you should be doing if you're an econ major, or that I would expect you to do as an econ major, but rather, what are your interests? Economics definitely has a role to play in that space. And so sort of matching it that way.
Yeah, I like that approach, because economics applies to pretty much everything. It's just the way you utilize the tools to answer that question. I'll definitely take that, write that down and utilize it when students ask me next time. Sure. So you mentioned summer. And, there's a perception that academics are free over the summer. They just do nothing. What do you do during the summer? How do you spend your time?
Long walks on the beach and lots of Netflix, lots of Netflix. No, yeah. So there definitely is that perception. And that's been hard even within my own family to sort of to make people realize, because they say, oh, well, are you teaching a class this summer? And I'm like, well, no, not this summer. I'm not, but I'm doing research, and they don't really have a great understanding of what that means, and that's fine. And I don't know that even if I took the time to really explain to them, it's challenging, right? So what do you spend your summer doing? I read a lot. Right? I read a lot of papers. If I'm lucky and I have a project that I'm working on, I probably am also doing a lot of writing and editing of drafts. I'm probably collecting data. Cleaning data, recleaning data, statistical analysis, so running regressions and things like that. So I'm doing a lot of that stuff for one. For another, I'm probably also working a lot on revising my courses. So econ is not something that is static, right? The world's constantly changing. So the international trade course that I taught last year is going to be different than the one I teach this year, because we've had new developments. Right, the trade war is in a different spot than it was then. So because the world is changing so much, I have to constantly sort of update my approach, and I'm constantly reading about not only sort of my research into international trade and economic growth, but I'm also reading, books and studies and articles on pedagogy. And if I see something that looks interesting, I think that would work in this specific course, and so I would do that. This summer, I was collecting lots of information on the Federal Reserve and sort of what they were doing with the economy, because I wanted our Fed Challenge students that participated in the competition this fall, I wanted them to come into the fall semester having a solid footing. And so I put together a lot of stuff for them to work on over the summer. So that was work too. So it's just because you're in the classroom, and even talking to sort of a person that's not in academia, even not during the summer, right? If you tell them you're a college professor, you're lucky if the conversation stops there, right? If they ask, well, like, when do you teach? You're like, well, I teach, Tuesday, Thursday, 2 classes. They think, well, what do you do the rest of the week? So, well, there's a lot of preparation that goes into those classes, and like you said, with the publication lead time on papers, there's a lot of work that goes into those papers. So the active learning paper that you mentioned actually happened pretty fast, and that was conceptualized in the summer of 2017, and I started collecting data in early 2018 on that. So it's something that is an iterative process and takes a lot of editing and revising and researching. And so summers is really, especially for somebody at a teaching focused institution, summer is really a place where I sort of catch up, so to speak, on sort of my research.
Yeah. So you're working, and the way I like to tell, I have the same issue with family and friends, and that they assume that a professor is just the time that you're in class. But the way that I like to think about my career in academia is more like entrepreneurship. You're running a business, and that business is your research and your teaching. So anytime that you're actually not, quote unquote, selling a product, you're working on, making that product better, whether it's the research or teaching. It helps me kind of feel better about the amount of time that I spend working. But it also allows for instance, my father to understand what I do better as well. Yeah,
I mean, you're absolutely right. We always have to, we talk about, our research as being sort of currency in the field. Mm-hmm. You always need to be ready if you have to leave, whatever those circumstances might be. Maybe it's that you don't get tenure. Maybe you have a family emergency that draws you closer to home. Maybe you have a pandemic that forces your school to cut back. Like, you never know sort of what can happen. And so you want to keep your skills as fresh as you can. And that includes both the teaching and the research. And so summer is a great time to sort of to sharpen those skills.
Great. So what is the one thing that is keeping you busy these days?
The one thing that's keeping me busy these days, it's diversity and inclusion efforts, and I feel even kind of strange saying that as like a white guy, but I think it's important for maybe people that look like me to be out there trying to do what they can to help foster these efforts, not only within economics. I think especially within economics, because we know that our discipline has such a problem with underrepresentation of voices sort of across the board. But also just within, even within sort of my own school. So both within my business school and within our university, we're really focused on that as an institution right now. And I'm on a couple of committees that are looking at different aspects of the issue and how we can increase diversity and inclusion. I think the first step is to helping people realize that diversity and inclusion are not the same thing, right? You can have diversity in certain sort of respects without actually having the inclusion part. So you don't just want people in the room, you need people in the conversation. And so that wasn't something that, I probably would expect to have taken up so much of my time, especially, at the beginning of my career. And that, I think, sort of represents some of the problem within the profession, was that wasn't something that was on my radar in 2012 when I graduated with my Ph.D. But now it's something that I constantly am thinking about ways to better sort of my own teaching in my own classroom, but also trying to reach out even broader than that, and making sure that we have representation in economics that can help us actually solve problems and issues.
Well, I applaud you for making that a goal of yours and working on it. As you said, we all have a role to play, and sometimes it's just getting the conversation started. And I see a lot of people shying away from the conversation than trying to join it. And I think it's because people are just afraid of how much their actions might have caused the issues, right? And we've all made mistakes. We've all had an influence on the current outcome. but we have to revisit it and think about what we can do better.
Right. And I think that really speaks to me because so for one, I teach a lot of white male students. So Elon is a predominantly white institution. We're doing better. I don't want this to come across as negative. We're doing a lot better in our recruiting efforts, but that takes resources. And so it's something that we're trying to make a lot of progress on. But because I see a lot of those students, I feel like I can remember how I was when I was their age. And I came from a rural part of Kentucky that was also predominantly white. And I came from a place of privilege. Not that I was, wealthy in any sort of, in any sort of way, but I was supported. I never had to worry about where my next meal was coming from. I never had to worry about having, shelter or clothing. Like all of my needs and then some were absolutely taken care of. And I was supported in education. My parents may not necessarily have known what I'm studying or been able to help me with it, but they knew that it was important and that they wanted me to do it. And so that opportunity that I, taking a college class as a high school student, even though other students may have had that put in front of them as an opportunity, I had the support and the push to go and actually do something like that. And so it's important for me to demonstrate to other people that maybe come from similar backgrounds, not only to provide that opportunity for other people, but also to show them, hey, you're really lucky to be here in this position. And you need to use that position for good as much as you can, right? Don't think that you necessarily are here because you worked harder than somebody else or because you're smarter than somebody else, right? I'm not, I tell this to my students, and students don't believe us as professors, I think, a lot of time, but, a lot of you as students, you're smarter than I am. Like, you just are. You're so much more advanced than I was when I was in a student, when I was your age. But don't take that for granted, right? You're still not going to be this. There's always going to be somebody that's smarter than you. But use your opportunity, use your privilege to help those around you and build those people up. And I think that's something that, as I've sort of grown and matured and in teaching students and seeing how that plays out in the classroom, that's been something that's been a lot more important to me than it was when I was, say, a high school student.
Well, I think that's a good place to kind of end this conversation with the fact that we all could do more in this area of diversity inclusion, and I like to say belonging as well. I think there's, we have to think about how comfortable somebody else feels in the space.
That's right.
So, before we leave today, because I've taken up a lot of your time already, and thank you for being here. Well, one thing I'd like to leave the audience with is there a resource right now, podcast, book, app that you're using that you would like other people to know about?
So there's lots. So I was trying to think. So if you're an academic, one of the resources that I use a lot right now is Explain Everything. So I'm using that a lot in the classroom. So that's been super helpful for me. And because we want to be able to draw a graph, and if you're teaching online, if you don't have a whiteboard, or that's just something that's low cost or free if you want it to be, if you have a tablet. So that's been a tool that I've been using a lot lately. Podcasts. I listen to so many podcasts. I'm such an academic. Like I consume a lot of podcasts. My favorite though is probably Planet Money's The Indicator. And Planet Money's The Indicator, and then I would have to also say Trade Talks. Planet Money, The Indicator is good because it's short. It's 10 minutes or no more than 10 minutes, and it's something that's accessible for students. The Trade Talks podcast is really great because they go into some of the weeds of trade policy, and it helps me with ideas about research, but it also helps me with ideas of explaining things to my students. Sometimes I'll assign them to students if they're accessible enough. But it's something that I really enjoy in keeping sort of apprised of everything going on.
Great. I'm always looking for new podcasts. at the beginning of the pandemic, and when we went into, extreme lockdown, I kind of stopped listening to podcasts, but it's something that's coming up more often. So thanks for those recommendations. And about Explain Everything, if you're using a tablet, one thing that I just purchased that has made my handwriting on tablets much better is Paperlike. I don't know if you've seen the ads. They're all over social media. But I highly recommend it. My graphs look so much better now, because one of the things with tablets and using a stencil or the iPencil is it doesn't feel natural. It feels like you're writing on glass, and this Paperlike adds a screen. It's kind of like a screen protector, but adds a little bit of a paper feeling to it.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's made my iPad more enjoyable to write on. So highly recommend it.
Awesome.
All right.
I'll do that.
Well, Brandon, I really appreciate you taking this time to meet, talk to me, and share some of the things that you're working on. And hopefully we'll have another conversation to get back to some of the projects that we need to complete. But thanks for being on Coffee with Dr. A today.
All right. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, Brandon. Have a good one. See you.